Hey everybody, I'm Michelle LeBlanc. I'm founder and a coach with OutRival Racing and QT2 Systems. And this presentation is an overview that we call the Baker's Dozen. It's just basically tips, overarching tips for endurance training. QT2 Systems and OutRival Racing were one business, two separate teams. And at QT2, we also have a Baker's Dozen that's somewhat similar to this one. This one probably has a little bit more content in it, so it's a little bit just broader in scope. But it's got a lot of good stuff. And these tips can be applied to almost anything that's endurance, meaning anything basically 20 minutes or over. You'll see that I focus quite a bit on Ironman just because we tend to coach a lot of Ironman triathletes. But the tips can be broadly applied across the board to all endurance sports. All right, so let's get going. All right, tip number one, you have to ask yourself, why do you race? If you don't know why you race, then ultimately your motivation, your discipline, your habits will change and they won't be focused. So you have to step back and ask yourself, and I would encourage you to do this on a regular basis, why am I doing what I'm doing? Am I just kind of sucked into the whole thing and just kind of stuck in a habit and I don't really want to be doing this? Am I doing this because I want to better myself? I want to improve my health. I want to challenge myself. I want to get outside and make some friends. Just make sure that you constantly assess why the heck you're training and racing. Because ultimately everything else you do or don't do basically kind of stem from this. So we each have our own individual reasons and they change over time. I encourage you to kind of figure out what yours are and make sure you have an honest conversation with yourself about why it is you do what you're doing in terms of training and racing. Along with that, once you kind of know why you're doing what you're doing, I definitely recommend that you set goals. Make the goals specific and measurable and where you can actually take particular action to meet the goals. Make them realistic. If you're just starting triathlon, it's not a realistic goal that you do an Ironman in half a year. We see that all the time, especially living here in the woodlands where we have an Ironman in our backyard. We see a lot of people that come from training 3 hours a week and right away they want to do the Ironman the next year. Just know that your goals need to be realistic and you need to slowly, incrementally add or work your way up to big goals. It's very risky health-wise and injury-wise and even just kind of overall long-term motivation and health-wise to strive for too lofty of goals without having stepping stones to those goals. The coaches at OutRival Racing and even QT2 Systems, we know some very set numbers and that can help you figure out whether you can get to a certain race distance within a particular time based on your current training. You also want to have a timeline that kind of speaks to that realistic goal. Good rule of thumb is that you want to at least do, kind of 3 races of shorter distance before you go to the next distance. For example, we recommend that you definitely try at least 3 sprints or Olympic distance races. This is kind of the minimum, or at least half marathons before even trying a half Ironman. Same thing with an Ironman, unless you have a really seasoned background in running or even cycling, then we definitely recommend you tackle at least a couple to a handful of half Ironmans before you tackle your first Ironman. Not that it can't be done, not that an Ironman can't be done without doing a half Ironman. That's not what I'm saying. Just saying that it's a better course of action to take it slowly and to take baby steps as you work your way up, particularly in distance. When it comes to when it comes to preparing for events, most people focus on the training only. There's so much more to preparing for big races, and that would be tip number 2, to just make sure that you cover all the bases. Look at training, look at your nutrition and rest, and those go along with training. Those are what we call the preparation phases or aspects of getting ready for a race or a race outcome. Next would be race fueling. Particularly the longer you go, the more that fueling becomes important. Race fueling for a 5K is not all that important. Race fueling for an Ironman is absolutely critical. And with race fueling, we mean hydration and mostly carbohydrate intake, a little bit of protein as well. Pacing, that would be mostly on race day, especially the longer you go, the more that pacing, actually that's not true. Any race distance pacing is important. From the mile run, not taking out too fast in that first 200 to 400, all the way to Ironman, pacing that day across each discipline and from discipline to discipline. Those are what we call the execution aspects of getting ready for a race. So the preparation of training and having good nutrition and rest are important. So are making sure that you address race fueling, hydration, and carbohydrate intake, as well as race day pacing within the swim, within the bike, within the run, and swim to bike to run across the day. Last would be the mental fitness. This is huge, and this crosses across all of the previous four. Mental fitness factors into your motivation to train, factors into even your rest, your sleep patterns, a little bit maybe even your race fueling if you struggle with kind of eating issues. Mental fitness is huge. Group camaraderie or team camaraderie is important to a lot of people. To some people it's not important, but we throw that out there because we've learned at OutRival Racing that being part of a team not only adds to mental fitness, but it adds to just the overall experience, to the triathlon experience. So cover all the bases. Look at all of these as you prepare for your races, as you kind of look at your whole triathlon experience, not just the training component. Tip number 3 would be to have a grand plan. I want to make sure that you have a season plan and even a year-to-year plan that has periods of work and rest. This is absolutely critical. And you want to break down your periods of work and rest into kind of year to year. You want to make sure you have an off season based on your yearly plan. And then you also want to have kind of more what we call a mesocycle, which would be having periods of work, like a 3-week build and then a 1-week recovery. And then same within a week, which is a micro scale, making sure that you have, 2, 3, 4 quality days, quality being either intensity or duration, followed by some rest days. A typical kind of training week, particularly for somebody who works Monday through Friday, a typical Monday through Friday 8 to 5 job. Typical rest days are Monday and Friday, or at least off the leg days or light days. Weekends tend to be your big days, and then quality tends to be Tuesday and Thursday, with Wednesday maybe being somewhat of a recovery day, or at least kind of an aerobic day. That's not necessarily the schedule that works for everybody. That's not the schedule that works for me. When I was a stay-at-home mom racing as a pro, I needed something that actually emphasized more Monday through Friday with more recovery on the weekends. But typically, we kind of see that schedule for a lot of athletes. I want to make sure that you know where your training is going. I want to make sure that you know also what your limiters are. What is the biggest thing that's holding you back from reaching your outcomes? Is it the training, the time to train? Is it your mind? Is it motivation? Is it discipline? Is it your body composition and your nutrition? Is it your lack of sleep? Is it, what is it? Is it your fueling? Is it race day fueling? You can check all the boxes of training, nutrition, rest, mental fitness. You're stronger than anything. If you don't know how much sodium you need on a particular event or bike ride, then your day can be done based on just being limited by your sodium intake. So always knowing what your current limiter is, what's holding you back the most, and tackling that first and foremost, or making sure that you're addressing that as you also progress in all the other areas. Without a plan, things can become just haphazard. They can become obsessive compulsive. They can become just reactive based on what everybody else is doing. It can become too much too soon. It can become too little. You just have to have a plan for sure in order to really systematically advance your fitness. I kind of talked a little bit about this. You want to make sure with your periodization that you have, this is kind of what we call linear periodization. That's a very typical age group periodization plan for most long course athletes, and that would be to start with the prep phase, just kind of getting back to routine, getting a little bit of base back, getting some pliability and just working the muscles, and then also mentally getting back into routine. Oftentimes this comes off after the Christmas holidays and getting back into the new year, getting back into a prep phase. Then going into a base phase where you really kind of lay the groundwork to having an aerobic base, so that when it's time to go into the build phase, whether that be an overload of volume or an anaerobic phase, particularly if you're racing short course or if you tend to need to be working on your anaerobic speed more, then you've got a solid base that when you go into those build phases, you're just able to recover faster and you're not risking injury. And then you'll go into a peak phase. Typically your peak phase is somewhere between kind of 1, 2, 3 weeks before your A race, all the way back to maybe 6 to 9 weeks. So that's what we call kind of the build to peak phase. And then the taper phase is for shorter races. The taper phase is usually a little bit shorter, like a 1 week or 2 week taper, depending on if it's an A or B race. And then the taper for an Ironman is definitely more like 2 or 3 weeks. Half Ironman, somewhere between 7 and 10 days is pretty typical. Here's an example at OutRival Racing. Actually, this is just an Excel spreadsheet that kind of breaks down by volume only here. We get much more specific at QT2 Systems with our periodization. But this is just an example of how to periodize your training. You can see we have some build weeks here, and then a recovery week, followed by build weeks that are a little bit higher, followed by a recovery week, followed by here we've got the build weeks very similar here, but a little bit more added intensity. With some recovery weeks. I think there's a race in here, so you see a race and then a recovery week. And then build an overload week that is higher in volume, and then going into some sprints and then off season. Actually, no, this is the taper right here going into an Ironman. All right, what are some typical hours that are required of an athlete or for particular distances based on your level? These are what we consider kind of the annual hours and then the weekly hours. Annual hours are on the left and then weekly hours are on the right. These are just kind of an estimate. So you can see for a beginner doing a sprint, 6 hours a week is sufficient. For a pro doing Ironman, 1,300 annual hours is typically what we see, with a peak of anywhere kind of in the low 30s to mid 30s. Here's an example of a build week. You can see that here on, like I mentioned earlier, on Mondays and Fridays, we tend to see these are kind of off legs day. You might even have an off day fully here, depending on the level of athlete. This is a little bit of a more serious athlete. Followed by quality days on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Got a quality bike here and a quality run, and a quality bike here. A recovery day on Wednesday. A quality day that's a long aerobic quality day on Saturday, followed by a long quality aerobic run on Sunday. We'd love to have bricks. We'd like to use a lot of brick runs or off-the-run bikes at OutRival Racing and QT2 Systems. We like to typically see the long run followed by the long bike, but that's not necessarily always the case. It depends a lot on the athlete's schedule, the athlete's limiters. If the athlete tends to be a little bit more run limited, meaning they need to work on the run, then we might switch these so that they're fresher for the run. So there's really no hard rule as to which whether the long bike needs to go before the long run. It's very athlete specific, and it's also good to maybe switch it up a little bit, maybe even bring the long run over here to a Thursday or even a Wednesday to separate out the longest sessions of the week. This just shows that there's some ebb and flow to a weekly schedule on a micro scale as well. All right, number four, we love the word durability. Durability just means that you can keep on keeping on. Means that you can resist stress and that you bounce back quickly. Having a solid aerobic base, no matter what distance you race, whether it's sprint on up, starting with a solid aerobic base is always what we recommend. We recommend avoiding what we call kind of the American way or the shortcut mentality, where less is more, and that you can get by, especially on the long stuff, by just doing speed work rather than laying an aerobic base in order to compensate for the stress load. Some concepts we like to use at OutRival and QT2 Systems, we like to term these sustainable, critical, and trailing volume. That's not a typo of training volume, that's actually trailing volume. So let's start actually with critical volume. Critical volume is what we deem is kind of the amount of training per distance that's, quote, required or needed for that distance to not be limited, to not have to slow down your pacing based on what your innate speed potential is. And I'll, on the next chart or the next slide, show you what I mean by that. So we have these numbers out there. We think you should do X amount of training. If you're going to do a half Ironman, this is the amount of training you should do. You should run, 30 miles a week at your peak week. You should bike whatever, 200 miles, whatever it is. I'll show you here in a minute. But no matter what the critical volume is, sustainable volume is the volume that you actually can do without getting injured, without overtraining, without getting burnt out, and without stagnation or regression of fitness. So this is huge. Sustainable volume is how much each individual at any particular time can actually handle and absorb. And sustainable volume always trumps critical volume. You always want to look first at how much volume you're doing and then incrementally add to that volume. You don't want to look and see what volume should I be doing for a particular distance and then try and tackle that if your body's not hasn't worked its way up to that. This is huge. We get asked all the time, like, how much should I be training for Ironman? When the question really should be, how much can my body handle in order to try and prepare for that Ironman? Can I get to the minimum amount of training necessarily to even toe the line? Can I get to the amount of training that I can basically race this thing without having to pace slower based on my lack of training? That's really important. Trailing volume is basically the volume that you actually kind of go into the race, your key race, with. So we typically define this as kind of the volume in the last 2 to 7 weeks before your A race. How much volume had you actually done when you toe the line going into the race? The trailing volume, basically what you're towing the line within your legs the last few months, is very, very important. All right, so a little bit more on critical volume. These are the recommended volumes that we recommend based on the particular race. You can crunch the numbers. This is just a formula. So you take the race distance. The race distance for an Ironman bike is 112 miles. For a half Ironman bike, here's the example that we've used, 56 miles. You multiply that by 8, divide by 3, and we suggest that you need to at least bike 150 miles for at least 2 weeks in your peak phase. Obviously, you want to work up to that in order to really be able to do the half Ironman without having to pace slower and really have to adjust your pacing based on your speed potential. So these are the formulas that we have found after looking at thousands of race results and training results working with athletes. Again, we're a team of over 40 coaches, and we've worked with thousands and thousands of athletes and had over 1,000 athletes cross the finish line in Ironman and half Ironman. So we've really kind of taken all that data and estimated some formulas that we think are fitting for those particular distances. You want to, for triathlon, meet these critical volumes for at least 2 weeks during basically the trailing volume period, the last 6 weeks prior to race day. For running, you need to meet the critical volume for at least 6 weeks. In order to get more durable, we definitely recommend that you have a solid aerobic base. This is the zone setting that we use at OutRival Racing and QT2 systems, where we have basically kind of a 4-zone system or 5-zone system. This one's just kind of above zone 4, where we have a recovery of zone 1, 2, 3, and 4. And this is where we recommend most of your training be done before you go into tempo and threshold work, and then top end VO2 max and peak intervals. Tip number 5, this is a broad tip. Use SMART training principles, and that's kind of a no-brainer. Train smart. Manage your overall stress budget. Don't train too much. Don't train to where you get sick, to where you get injured, or to where you regress in your fitness. This is huge. Rest when overly tired, no matter what you have planned. Overly tired is just above and beyond, where if you push through that next workout, you know that you're going to be overreaching, and you risk having to take off or having even junk mileage the following days after that. So rest when you're overly tired. It's oftentimes better to give up a day of training if you have a sniffle or a cough, nip that cold or whatever is brewing in your chest in the bud, and then come back strong in a couple days and have a solid week. So always better to kind of give up a day or two rather than pushing through and then having to give up a week or even a month by getting sick or injured. You want to pay attention to what I like to term the precursors to injuries. These are not injuries, but there's always something that comes before an injury. There's a time period, unless it's obviously a crash or something, but there's a time period that is a lead up to an injury. Muscles are overly tight, tendons are just a little bit tight. Your shin bone is speaking to you. It's not fractured, but it's definitely kind of it's a shin splint, and if you push through it, then you're going to end up having a stress reaction or fracture. So pay attention to the warning signs that lead to injury and back off when those warning signs hit. Do not be afraid to back off. If you do not back off, you will lead to full-fledged injury, and then you'll be down and out. You want to balance volume, frequency, duration, and intensity with plan and purpose, and that speaks to a little bit periodization. We recommend that most workouts, unless there's a particular purpose, that you descend them, meaning that for the most part you think of building across the workout, no matter what kind of workout it is. Whether it's an aerobic workout, if it's a recovery workout, then no. I mean, recovery is recovery, and it can't be too easy. But on an aerobic workout even, you want to definitely build through it and try and finish a little bit stronger than you started. If it's an interval workout, say 4 by 1 mile on the track, you definitely want to pace it so that the mile repeats are either similar in pace or at least pick up in pace as it goes. Unless again the workout's kind of prescribed to ascend or have a particular different purpose to it. You want to take the easy days easy, and that's so that the hard days can be hard. Most people tend to not take the easy days easy, and therefore the easy days tend to kind of go in that gray area, and then athletes aren't fresh enough to then make the hard days hard. Hard days are not necessarily intense days. These can be quality or quantity. A 6-hour ride is a hard day. So you want to make sure that if your Friday workout is easy, you take it so easy that you can have a quality 6-hour ride on Saturday. Or if you have mile repeats again, using that as an example, then you want to make sure that your easy workout the day or two before is easy enough that you're ready for those mile repeats. All right, I threw in these. I won't talk too much on these, but you can read through these if you'd like, just touching a little bit more on kind of descending every workout and then taking the easy days easy and why that's so important. Here's just some more details on that. And then again, making the hard days hard. And here's some examples of workouts, swim workouts, bike workouts. I love this quote, no first mile hero, last mile zero. What that means is don't take out a workout so hard, bike workout, if you have 5 by 5 threshold intervals, don't take them out so hard that by number 3, you're too tanked to finish number 4 or 5. That will kill your mental fitness. You want to make sure that every workout you pace, that you pace it so that you can first and foremost finish the darn workout without going to DEFCON 1 and falling off the ledge. So not only is it important physically to descend workouts, it's important mentally to make sure that the first goal is to get through the workouts, that you don't punch the workout out so hard at the beginning that you can't even really finish it as planned. Number 6, consistency is key. This is absolutely critical to reaching your goals. Avoiding injury, avoiding illness, not racing too much because that disrupts fitness ultimately. I mean, racing is very important to improving mental fitness, and even physically it also helps because it's a hard anaerobic workout, I mean, depending on the distance. But when we race too much, we actually erode our fitness because we're worried about taper and recovery. So consistency can actually be broken. Consistency of fitness can be broken because of racing too much. Do not train through races. A lot of times we see athletes train through races because they got to race mentally. They just have to race. If you toe the line and you're not physically rested, you can create a cycle of excuses. You can come away from that race and say, you know what, I didn't do that well because I was tired. And then down the road, you can toe the line for a race that you really are ready for. And then halfway through when you get tired, you can, in the back of your mind, you're like, you know what, this race doesn't really matter. I'm just training through this one. I'm tired. So it can create a bad cycle of excuses. Athletes are notorious for poor recovery. Most athletes, most triathletes are type A. We all know that. So more than anything, when in doubt, oftentimes recovery is better than not, especially if you're asking yourself whether you think you need recovery or not, you probably do. Number 7 is all about the law of specificity. Be race ready in many and every single way that you possibly can. Not only training specifically for the distance in terms of how much, the intensity and frequency and volume and all that, and over distance rides and runs, but you want to train for the climate. If it's going to be hot and humid, you need to train and acclimate those last 4 to 6 weeks going into the race. You want to train for the terrain. If it's going to have 10% grade hills, you want to ride some 10% grade hills, both physically to work the muscles in the manner that you're about to race, but also mentally to prepare. You want to prepare for any other unique race characteristics. If it's a dive start off a boat, you want to practice diving with your goggles and making sure that you understand kind of, what that entails. If there's running in sand, then you want to kind of make sure that you try that a little bit. If there's just something weird about that particular race, make sure that you practice that before going into the race. If you have a lot of anxiety with open water or you're not experienced, I definitely recommend you practice open water swimming in the same exact gear you're going to use, the wetsuit you're going to use or the speed suit or whatever tri-suit, and try and get into water that mimics the race that you're going to be, that you really care about. That's really hard to do, especially if you're going to a traveling race, but just do the best you can. You want to practice all the equipment you plan to use, and you want to do this at least 2 weeks out. I see so many athletes going and purchasing equipment kind of the Monday before a big race. They buy new shoes, they buy new race, goggles, they buy new kit, and they haven't practiced it to see if it, chafes them or if they fog or if they leak. So you definitely want to practice a few weeks out, the longer the better, with the equipment you plan to use for your most important races. Same with race wheels. You want to get out some and ride race wheels a few weeks out, particularly if you're not used to race wheels or an aero helmet. You want to practice your fueling to a T. The longer you go, the more your fueling becomes important. So you want to make sure that you practice your fueling in your training identically. Not only mentally to figure out what works and what doesn't for you, but also to train the gut to process carbohydrates. So this is absolutely critical for long stuff. Race the distance that you're trained for. Don't go any farther. Don't all of a sudden just convince yourself to jump in a marathon when you haven't run over 12 miles. That's very risky. It just won't make you happy in the long run. Again, don't race too much. Pace properly in the race. Cycling races, for those of you that are triathletes wanting to venture into cycling races, which I've seen this a lot. I've coached some top-level cyclists and race cycling races myself. Just know that cycling races, the bike handling becomes much, much more important than triathlon races. And just make sure that your bike handling is good for the type of cycling races you want to go into, especially if you're looking at going into crit or circuit races. Just make sure that your bike handling is good. If you're not sure if it is, ask somebody that is a roadie whether they think your handling is good, and they'll tell you, honestly. All right, tip number 8, improve your mental game. Here's just some things that you can do to help improve your mental game and toe the line just that much more fit, both physically fit and now mentally fit. You can control your thinking, your emotions. You can work on what you focus. Visualization ahead of time is key. A lot of this is kind of textbook stuff. You can even Google some stuff on how to improve your mental game in sport, and you'll find some great resources out there. At OutRival Racing and QT2 Systems, we have a couple sports psychologists that do just this, help you improve mentally, your mental fitness. Protect your confidence. What I mean by that is don't hang out with people, especially as you lead into an A race, that rattle your confidence, that make you feel more nervous or less confident in your abilities. Most of us as triathletes, we hang around with a lot of other triathletes. That's just kind of the way it works. And a lot of times that can, leading into a race, it can make us more nervous when we're seeing other people get more nervous or other people have doubt about their training. So protect your confidence. Avoid particular situations or people, especially as you lead into an A race, that are going to rattle your confidence and make you feel any less than a rock star as you head into a race. You want to keep your excitement or arousal level in check. What we mean by that is when you head into kind of the taper phase and then race week and then race day, you want to make sure that your anxiety or your excitement level, your nervousness isn't so high that it's going to compromise your outcome. So do what you need to do race week to stay relaxed, stay calm, but then also not so calm that you're not excited about the race. There's kind of a happy medium there. Tip number 9, everybody's favorite. Not really, is to eat right. I mean, we could have a whole nother presentation on this. And at Core Diet, which is also part of QT2 and OutRival Racing, we have some great dietitians that can help you eat right if you're not quite sure what that means. And this is more kind of daily eating, focusing on what we call the core principles of eating basically fresh from the farm gate foods, of healthy vegetables and fruits and lean meats and dairy and legumes and just, you know, really eating stuff that has high nutrient dense foods. You want to limit the intake of grains and sugars, or at least time it based on your training. A lot of times when the training load goes up, the need for sugars and grains go up as well. And then we see athletes not eating fruits and vegetables because they just literally don't have the time to, or they're just craving other stuff. Just make sure that you keep up on your fruits and your vegetables and your highly nutrient-dense foods, even when the training load gets heavy. Get rid of extra baggage. That means just obviously try and get your body composition to where it's a healthy level. You want to obviously do this safely. If you try and cut your weight too quickly, it can actually be more stressful on the body and in the long run do you more harm than good. Again, here are some of the core foods that we recommend: fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, healthy oils, oils that are definitely high in omega-3s, salmon, walnuts for sure are some of the most anti-inflammatory foods from a healthy oil standpoint. And then you want to keep blood sugar stable throughout the day by eating small, frequent meals every 2 to 3 hours. This is really critical to just overall health. All right, tip number 10 is to take race fueling seriously. I think I already mentioned this a little bit, but just make sure that you figure out what your hydration needs are, and that breaks down into fluids, that breaks down into sodium, that even breaks down a little bit into the other electrolytes of magnesium, potassium, even manganese, some of the more, smaller electrolytes, if you will, that the body uses. So you want to make sure that you have a good hydration plan. You want to make sure that you have a good fueling plan in terms of carbohydrates and protein and fat. And that fueling plan is, you know, it really starts kind of race week and then race morning. Make sure that you have a good race morning breakfast plan, and then race day, what your plan is on the bike, obviously, and then on the run. And then also a post-race plan, particularly if it's a smaller race and you're still in the heat of training. You want to make sure that you consume a nice recovery something, drink or food in that post-recovery window. At Core Diet and OutRival Racing QT2 Systems, we offer race fueling plans, and those are one of our more popular services, where we put you through a sweat rate test where you can do remotely at home, and it helps you figure out your individual sweat rate needs, sweat rate losses, and then needs obviously for particular races, as well as your carbohydrate and protein needs. Not only that, you need to practice your plan in training to a T, refine it, perfect it. I think I already touched on this. You want to use a recovery drink within that 30-minute recovery window, mostly of carbohydrates, but a little bit of protein as well. And then you want to never, ever bonk. Bonking basically is letting your blood sugar go down. It's very stressful on the body. So you want to make sure that you keep your blood sugar stable, keep consuming food throughout the day. If your training level's high, actually if it's not high, you still want to consume small frequent meals every 2 or 3 hours. And then as you train as well, you want to keep your blood sugar stable. You don't want to go out on a 4-hour ride and have 1 bottle of Gatorade. You will be struggling to keep your blood sugar stable. Here's kind of some tips on using a recovery drink. You can read through these. I won't touch on these, but we definitely have some strong recommendations as to what type of recovery drink you should use, and then kind of when that should ideally be consumed. Tip number 11 is to focus on restoration. Make sure that you restore yourself every so often. You have to have an ebb and flow of work and then rest, work and then rest. And the most important thing that you can do in order to make sure that you don't overtrain or overreach and stay healthy and advance your fitness is to sleep at least on average 7.5 hours a night. And that's kind of on average. A lot of people, if they work Monday through Friday, they struggle with that. They might sleep 6.5 hours a night or even less. If that's the habit, if that's the routine that you've fallen into, then definitely do some catch up on the weekends. A lot of times overtraining or athletes not progressing their fitness is not because they aren't training enough or training harder. It's because they're under resting. So sleep is critical. You also want to incorporate body work, active massage, compression, stretching, using a foam roller, using ice baths, taking a full mental break. We like to encourage kind of a rule, a 4-to-1 in terms of time, in terms of work to rest ratio. So for every 4 hours of training you do, you should be doing about an hour of kind of active recovery stuff, of massage, of stretch, of foam roller, of healthy eating. So just make sure that you don't under rest and keep pushing, because the rest is a big part of the formula to advancing fitness. Here's a little bit more on just sleeping 7.5 hours a night and why it's so important. That's when your hormone levels replenish. That's when growth hormone is secreted from the pituitary, and your body basically heals itself back up. So it's very, very important. Here's a slide we like to use based on, we get asked this all the time, like how long should I wait between doing a half Ironman and doing another half Ironman? Well, it depends a lot on how many hours, how durable you are, basically how many hours a week you train. So if you look here, for example, an athlete that is training for a half Ironman and trains under 12 hours a week, and that's their first race, and then wants to do another half Ironman, our recommendation is that 6 weeks in between those two events is a good rule of thumb. But if you jump over to an athlete that is training a lot more and more durable, we recommend that they can do a back-to-back half Ironman double with about 4 weeks of rest. So that's kind of the comparison. It's not a hard rule for every athlete. It depends a lot on the athlete's durability. And lastly, tip number 12 is the warm and fuzzy. We find that this is very important, that you keep an overall balance and perspective of sport as it relates to your personal life and your work life and your family life and your friends. This is huge. We see a lot of athletes just get too entrenched in this sport and they throw everything into it, and at some point something gives. Family falls apart, work falls apart, and this is just so critical. We kind of have a saying here that Jesse Kropelnicki and I like to use when we present, and that's that it's very, very hard to have a full-time job, a full-time family, and train for Ironman all simultaneously without one of those popping or without one of those taking a hit. So just keep that in mind, that's pretty typical. So if you know that you want to head into an Ironman season, have a hard conversation with your family and make sure that they're on board, make sure that they know you're about to be kind of MIA for the next 8 to 12 weeks, or you won't be doing as much as you have been, or maybe wait until your workload is in a lighter phase before you and time that with your Ironman training. That's really, really important. If not, you'll get imbalanced and something will give, and ultimately you'll be unhappy. So prioritize what's important to you. Make sure that that you focus on the things that, especially kind of day to day. If all of a sudden a child gets sick and you have a 6-hour ride on the schedule, just know that in the long run, prioritizing what's most important to you will make you a happier person no matter what. And then also be patient with your progress, and then be grateful for what you can do on a daily basis. All right, tip number 13 is basically there's no magic formula. There is no one way to train, no one way to progress and advance fitness. Every athlete is different. We all know that. Find what works for you. Find day-to-day nutrition that works for you, race fueling that works for you, a pacing plan that works for you. Know that it just takes time to especially for the long stuff, to slowly build up. Rome was not built in a day. All right, thanks for listening. I hope you learned something. Feel free to contact us at www.outrivalracing.com or at QT2 Systems, www.qt2systems.com, and we'll answer any questions you have. Thanks.